Okay, and we are live. Awesome. Okay, welcome to the session. We've got, wow, 185 people already joined. This is awesome. Okay, yeah, so welcome to Shared Coordinates, because after all these years, I still don't get it. My name is Krigh Bachmann, and we're going to let people join in here. We've got a couple of minutes. I've just got kind of a fun poll. If you guys are joining us right now, I'm going to ask you, if you go to, in your browser, menti.com, in another tab or a little window off to the side, you can use that code at the top. And just while we're waiting for everyone to join in, you can throw in what country you're calling in from, just so we can quickly kind of get a sense of that. As well as, while we're doing that quick little poll, obviously, if you guys have questions and stuff like that, there is the Q&A session. There we go. One for USA. Awesome. Oh, a few. Romania, Canada, US. Awesome. Hey, this is pretty cool. Welcome, welcome. So yeah, just welcome to this is Shared Coordinates session. We're just waiting for a few. Oh, obviously, yes, somebody's here from the moon. I knew there was going to be somebody cheeky. So as we're getting started, if you guys do go to the pollings and just let us know quickly where you're calling in from, just while we let a few more people join the session. I am Krigh Bachmann, and this is going to be Shared Coordinates, because after all these years, I still don't get it. Joining me on my call is my colleague, Megan. Hello.
Hello.
I don't know where I'm at. These days, none of us know where we're at. It's all over the place. Okay. And also, so as I mentioned, the Q&A session, this is a Q&A session for Shared Coordinates. If you do have a question, you can go to the Q&A panel and pop your question in there. Megan is going to be filtering through and moderating those questions. Awesome. Well, it's great to see you guys coming from all over the world. We've even got somebody in from New Zealand. Oh boy.
Yeah.
All over the world. Romania, Finland. Awesome, guys. Okay, well, keeping things moving along. So we're going to give people a couple of minutes to join here. The second question, of course, just so we know the audience, you'll see a little survey question come up. How well do you know shared coordinates? And there's a few different options there. You've never configured the coordinates. You've tried, but you didn't get them to work. You've gotten them to work, but you're still not sure how to do it, hence the dark art. And you are a shared coordinates ninja. This is the term that I usually use whenever I'm talking to my staff. So we're just I'll give people one more minute to join the session, and then I'm going to do a quick little summary and kind of give you guys a little bit of the background to it. We've got 391 people on this.
Wow.
So welcome everybody. I am also not surprised in some ways that we've got so many. I did this session a few years ago back at another conference, and it was one of the most requested sessions, only because I think that the title kind of everyone sort of said we weren't sure about doing this, but it is one of those topics that just everybody, after all these years, we still don't get it. So thanks for jumping in there. So looks like the vast majority of you have gotten them to work, but you're still not sure how you did it. I kind of hope that this session helps clarify that. So as I've said, we're going to move on to the session. We're going to get rolling with things. But as you know, the Q&A panel is up there. So please pop. The whole purpose of this, you guys get your chance to ask questions. If you haven't been in any session so far, there's a little Q&A panel. Just type them in there. Megan is going to help me moderate. And with that, I think we're going to get going. So let me just flip over here. Okay, so
Awesome.
welcome everybody. So yes, this is the Q&A session for Shared Coordinates, because after all these years, I still don't get it. My name is Krigh Bachmann. I am the leader of digital innovation at Dialogue. We are a design practice based out of um, out of Canada and the United States. But it's and I've been working on a lot of different things over the past few years. I work as all sorts of different things, but shared coordinates is one of those things that I kind of got into my head into, and people still come back to me again and again to ask about. So this is your chance to join in and asking some questions. Joining me on the call is also from Dialogue is Megan Brooks. Say hello, Megan. And
Hello.
she is going to be acting as our Q&A moderator. She is one of our design technology specialists and one of my colleagues here. So I did want to kind of just revisit. There's a lot of stuff in shared coordinates that we can go over, and I'm going to try to answer as many of your questions here. I know some people were asking me comments and stuff on the page. By the way, if you can go there directly to the page and ask a question as well after the session if you think of another one. Um, and I'll try to respond, but there's only so much that we could cover. So the main thing is I tried to create something that could let you guys understand the shared coordinates. But again and again, people always ask me about, well, how do you apply that to a project? And so these were kind of the objectives that I wanted to cover. And if you guys haven't been to the AU website and see, well, you probably have been there, but do make sure that you download the presentation, which is the sort of slides, the handout, which has a whole bunch of additional text, including some additional material I couldn't fit into the actual session because we only had it. I don't know if you noticed, but it's 56 minutes or 59 minutes, 56 seconds. I literally was down to the wire. And then the data sets, which is the most important thing, which is the exercise files. You can actually use them with your staff to teach other people. If you're trying to understand it, go back and practice with them. And in that, I tried to cover off two main things, which is the concept file that goes through the shared coordinates and how to manipulate them around. It sort of shows you behind the scenes. I've got that open on my screen. I can dive into it to show you guys on the screen. But the other one is people ask me again and again, but okay, that's the concept. How do you apply it in a real world example? And in this case, that's why I took an example, just like I would have done when I was working in the UK. This site was situated in Wales using a real coordinate system and try to set it up and show it to you. And so hopefully this is giving you guys a bit more of an opportunity. But with that, we are now going to dive into some questions here. So with that, I'm going to switch back over and see what we've got.
All right, Krigh. We have some wonderful questions pouring in here. So the first one is kind of a two-part answer for you. So the first one is at the beginning of the project, who should be responsible to decide on the shared coordinates? And then with that, which project file should have the coordinates to acquire from? Architectural, civil, mechanical?
Good question.
What's going with that?
Typically, in our experience, it's been whoever is the BIM lead, which is typically the prime consultant, which happens to be architectural a lot of the times. So if, for example, the architectural team sets up and starts the site file, and then they've got their building positioned on it, those are going to be the first two files typically that start with a project. So I would typically suggest that they are the first ones that kind of establish the shared coordinates. And then those files are then passed on to the other consultants, and they should then take their files and acquire from them. And I typically would recommend that workflow. There is some stuff in the handouts that sort of has a workflow about kind of who should be acquiring versus publishing. But typically, I would sort of say it's the prime consultant that we typically, or we've typically had that experience of doing it, which is architectural.
Definitely. That's wonderful. So the next question that came in kind of ties into that one. So it says, when a consultant acquires coordinates from the main file, does it really matter if you're SP clipped or unclipped? Sorry,
Survey point is clipped or
survey
unclipped.
point, yes.
Yeah. Okay, does it when they acquire the coordinates? I don't believe so. Okay, there is some. Actually, I can show this on the screen when it comes to Revit. So the whole question of clipped or unclipped things, a lot of this will come up in. Let me just maximize this. There we go. A lot of this will be um, if it's unclipped, it sort of doesn't, the coordinates can update and it doesn't move or it doesn't stay in its specific spot. The one issue that you may have is that if you do a zoom extents, you may end up with something like this, where your survey point is located like, in the real world origin and your file kind of updates. Besides that, in my experience, it doesn't really matter if it's clipped or unclipped, other than the fact that it's going to lead to you having to do things like this, where it's way off to the side and you have to zoom in. But the actual behavior of acquiring the coordinates, it shouldn't affect the actual acquisition of the coordinates.
Awesome.
Okay, next.
So the next one that we have here, it's a little bit of a longer one, so I'm going to read it word for word for you. So it says, most of the surveys we receive are in a localized coordinate system. When we start a Revit project, we simply link in the CAD file using origin to origin and then acquire its coordinates. We then unclip the survey point and position it to a relevant boundary. We carry our checks between the CAD and Revit model, and everything seems fine. Does this process seem okay? We don't normally get issues with the 20-mile mark.
Mm. Okay, so the 20-mile mark, um, this was one that the 20. Okay, so if I understand what they said correctly, if the files are located locally, you guys, and you're linking them in, and you're not given any issue with the 20-mile limit, as long as those files are being linked in, and you're because it said that they have localized files.
Mm-hmm.
So if the localized file, if it's laid out in a way that you're acquiring the coordinates from it or you're positioning based off of it, as long as it doesn't give you any issue with the 20-mile limit, it's typically okay. The process, somebody on the website asked me, why do you localize your files? And I wanted to kind of show this to you guys on the screen here. Let me just bring this file out. Because there's some people that have sort of said they've linked in files and they say, oh, but there's no real problem with it, because you can see, like, I can link in the file and everything looks fine about it. And this was a file that the background is blocked because it's beyond 20 miles. But if I actually zoom in here, what you will start to see is you'll start to see multiple lines. And you can sort of see how there's a secondary, the lines are not actually lined up. That's because the CAD file in the background is actually jumping around. So you can see that even though I traced that CAD file, that's actually what's going to geometrically happen if things are beyond 20 miles. If you're linking stuff in and it's actually coming in and it's fine where it is because it's been localized, it's not beyond the 20-mile limits, you're probably okay. The main thing, as I try to explain in all of my in my recorded session, is as long as whatever the coordinates are that you read off that survey file, if you're trying to kind of put in a spot coordinate on it in CAD, and that same spot coordinate you pull inside of Revit is the same, it typically is okay. But what I would do beyond that, going back to, is it okay regarding the 20 miles, look at your CAD and see if it's doing this jumping around. If it is, you may still have a problem with it, because it graphically, like, I'm not certain if this is actually going to be graphically okay and whether or not the coordinates are actually going to report correctly, because right now the CAD is jumping all over the place, so I don't trust it. That's why I localize my files. Okay?
Awesome. Thank you. The next one that we have here is, how does shared coordinates affect Navisworks and IFC formats?
Okay. They do affect it. Like I said, there's so much to cover inside the session. The main thing to sort of understand in doing that, let me see if I can show you guys a quick example here. So if we were to kind of jump into, I'm just going into a 3D here, so that whenever you go in and you're exporting either Navisworks or you're exporting, there are settings in here. And typically what you want to do is you want to have your shared coordinates set up for your site. And then there's little bits like this. Let me bring it back onto my screen here. So where you see coordinates shared, and then I actually opened up the settings within IFC as well. I'm not going to do it on the screen, just conscious of time. But there are ways that you can set it by shared coordinates as well. So this is, again, if you're dealing with stuff where you're trying to coordinate things across real world examples, like you're trying to do a site like I showed all set out in real world, you'll want to make sure that that's all set to shared, and you want to have all the consultants working off the same thing. And then what happens is your Navisworks files will all drop in, for example, right on top of each other as if they're out in the real world, all coordinated. Because if you don't do that, they'll all come in origin to origin, and they'll be all over the place, and you have to manually align them all. So without going into too much detail, that's basically, yes, they are still affected that way.
Awesome. Thanks, Krigh. So the next one that we have is why can't I modify or publish shared coordinates on BIM 360? I have a civil Revit file publishing to the architectural Revit file, which then publishes to all other discipline Revit files. I set up shared coordinates and publish prior to uploading to BIM 360, but sometimes the building moves during the process.
Yeah. So I'm not officially from Autodesk. I can't officially answer that question. I actually was seeing, I just happened to catch a conversation on Twitter where somebody was saying the same thing this morning. I don't know entirely why BIM 360 acts that way. The publishing, from what I've understood, the publishing won't work because it's actually, as I've said in my session, publishing is reaching into the other model and pushing that information from your Revit file into another. And for some reason, BIM 360 doesn't like that. However, the actual acquiring of it, because it doesn't affect the other file, you should be able to do that. But updating the files later on, that unfortunately is where BIM 360, again, you can't change the location. For example, you can't grab the building in the site file, move it into a new position, and then save that location back, where you normally could do that on other systems like Revit servers and network drives. But you can, I believe, still go in and say, okay, but I want to update the coordinates at this specific point, but you'd have to go into each and every single model separately to do that. So it's an unfortunate pain. I don't know, Autodesk might have an answer for us one of these days, or they might update BIM 360 to allow it. But at this point, it is publishing on BIM 360 from one file to the other isn't an option.
Awesome. Thanks, Krigh. So the next one that we have speaks to a couple different questions, actually. They want to know how multiple buildings on the same site are affected by the shared coordinates and what's a great process to set that up. For example, a campus site that has multiple different buildings and different shared coordinates per building, what does that process look like?
Okay. And that is, a lot of that is exactly what we covered off. Let me just see if I can bring it back here. We've got concept file. There we go, beyond 20 miles. Let me just get back to my, hold on a second. So in my tutorial that I did in my main class, so if you haven't had a chance to actually view, let me go to example of a concept. Hold on a second. Where is? Sorry, I'm just making sure that you guys can see. In my main class, that's what I covered off, is how to actually set up a building on the site. Let me just bring up. Oh, yeah, there we go. Sorry. It was zoomed in, so I couldn't see it. Okay. So, dealing with a site file, campus file, I think was the question. The main class that I've got, if you haven't watched my full video tutorial, which is 1 hour, it explains how I would go through that process. I would typically set up my site file, which is kind of what I have on the screen here. And with that, I would be linking in my separate buildings into that as separate separate Revit files that are linked in. Each of these, there was somebody that made a note that they said they've been trying to convince people for years to do a site file that's separate from a building file. I always did this because you can set up your site file, you set it up using shared coordinates, you set up the real world coordinates in that you can specify, here's my setting out for my whole project. I know that this is a real world coordinate. You get all of the you can drop in spot coordinates and see how they relate to whatever real world coordinate systems that you're using, and then you can position your buildings on that. And if your buildings update at any point, you can then go in and update the coordinates for them and they move around on the site. Now, if you're doing this in an early stage, you can also actually, if I physically grab this model and move it over, it will actually ask me whether or not I want to save that new position back into the file. So it kind of gives you a little bit more of that sort of top-down bird's eye approach of being able to grab models and move them around and sort of shift them around almost like little Lego pieces. So you can easily kind of position them on the site. That's kind of how I would set it out. So as a kind of very basic thing, it's one of those ones that watch the video tutorials, download the files that I've got in my data set, run through that process, and it should give you a fundamental understanding of how to kind of set it out, if that's it.
Awesome. Thanks, Krigh. The next one is maybe a tricky one for you. Have you ever had to coordinate with a point cloud file? And if so, how did you deal with a 20-mile limit? And did you have to truncate the point cloud site datum?
Wait, so the second part of that, what did you say? The,
Um,
the point
if you
cloud.
had, yes, how did you deal with the 20-mile limit? And did you have to truncate the point cloud site datum?
Okay, if you're dealing with anything where it's a point cloud data, in all of the models that we've worked with, we've typically set them out using more local coordinates. Like they're not set out at miles from their origin. I personally haven't. Well, going back to the initial part of the question, have I worked a lot with point clouds in real world coordinates? No, I haven't. But typically, if you're running into issues with 20-mile limits, try to get the data back closer to the origin point as much as possible. So in that case, if for some reason somebody created a point cloud that the actual origin point in it is miles and miles away, like beyond the 20 miles, you'd probably need to localize it using the method that I created in this model where I kind of have all the origins based around a common point. Um, Typically, I would sort of say if you could do that, then you might be able to align the two and get them to drop in on top of each other so you don't have to kind of manually move it.
Awesome. Thank you, Krigh. If a project is started up without shared coordinates, and you have to implement them later on, what is the best workflow that you recommend?
Yes, because I know that a lot of people sort of say again and again, start your files origin to origin. And I've worked on some pretty major projects where people have said, oh, if they're not set up origin to origin, you can't possibly do it later on. That's not true. Basically, if the files are not set up, in fact, as I went through my tutorial, I even showed you guys that if the structural model here within this building A and the building A don't actually align because they were created with two different origin points, you basically just at some point have to align the two. One of them has to acquire, one of them has to publish. So in this whole thing, somebody is going to be setting out the coordinate system. So if you start out by saying, okay, if it's the prime consultant, it's the architectural team, and they're establishing coordinates, then once building A's architectural model knows that that's the coordinate system, it's actually quite easy to do at that point if the files haven't done a handshake at all. Because what will happen is you basically just pick the file and you'll say acquire from this file, and your file will just suddenly adopt their shared coordinates, and that's basically it. If you've done shared coordinates, but then the coordinate system updates because suddenly everyone decided, well, this project was set out around a local origin point on the corner of the property line, and now we want it in real world, you can also do that. You just have to go into each file and kind of going through a similar process of kind of what I showed you guys in the example is I would pick points and say, specify coordinates at point and just simply type in the coordinates, and then they'd kind of come, you'd be able to align those models back to bring them all back together. So it is something you can do later on in a project. It just means a bit more legwork of going into each file separately and just updating it so that they all align back together using shared coordinates.
Awesome. Thank you. So the next one is more about you, Krigh. They want to know if you have your own specific YouTube channel that has no time restraints, so you can start your coordinates with Krigh sessions.
I, 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 to be honest, I haven't actually done that until now. I have now
Yeah.
I've gone on YouTube and I've actually uploaded the video from um, that I produced for Autodesk. Plus, I've got one video in there so far that's bonus material that shows you how to link. For example, it was actually the one where I did this, where I started linking in the same model twice in two locations. I am going to try to add more videos. So if you
Awesome.
search on there, it may take a while until it shows up when you search for Krigh. Um, but yes, I will be posting more videos.
Perfect. You have a very lovely fan base here. The next one is more to the process here. So it says I link in the architectural model and acquire their coordinates. Coordinates match, base and survey points match, yet when I link in my model, it sits a meter too high. Would that be a physical alignment required on their part, or is there something else I should be doing coordinates wise?
Okay, so if the models, um, so it by the sounds of it, if they've acquired coordinates, so this is so I'm going to guess
Mhm.
structural, for example, or mechanical, acquires the coordinates from the architectural. If they're now saying that the architectural, if you've given your model back to the architectural team and it's sitting a meter too high,
Mhm.
A, check with them that they have linked your model in by shared coordinates, because there are times when they will sit there and say, oh, we linked your file back in, it's not coming in the right place, and they actually linked it origin to origin. But beyond that, if they did their job and they linked it by shared coordinates, then it probably means that your file, when you were looking at it, looked like it was in the right spot, but was actually sitting, you started your file, for example, a meter higher than they did. In that case, what you can do is you can probably flip into an elevation, um, take a look at it. You'll see the two files probably separated. If at that point, if you actually just go specify coordinates at point and pick your one of your levels and tell it to the proper height it should be at, it will just basically realign to the architectural model. Um, or alternatively, I mean, with Revit, there's a million different ways of doing it, but that would be the simplest way of doing it. You could also do things like you can, well, there's different ways. You could also get it so that the arc. No, that's probably the best way of doing it. We'll just leave it at that.
Okay, perfect.
I'm trying to get through as
So the
many
next
questions as I can here.
Definitely. So the next one is one of our favorites. We all know that error, that geometry in the file has extents greater than 20 miles. So this is a common question that's coming up is how do we get rid of that error? Is it in the CAD file that we have to mitigate that, or is it within the Revit file itself?
It is inside the CAD file, and this is one where um, if if you're still a little bit confused about this, go back, watch the video tutorial, the main video on the website on AU, where I show how I localize a file. And this is one where this is an example. This CAD file in the background, I have picked in this case, this is the Ordnance Survey grid from the UK, and I picked a local setting out point. So I had to move the CAD file so that that grid line right there is sitting on the 20 mile, or is sitting at the 0 by 0 in CAD. So if I flip back to let me go back to my AutoCAD. So as an example, if I'm in AutoCAD and I do a line from 0 by 0, and that's, you can kind of see it's way down there, right? That's not going to work. That's going to be beyond the 20 miles. Okay. But if I go in here and I grab that point and I actually localize that at the 0 by 0, as I've shown in my tutorials, okay, in the main video, locate that down by the 0 by 0. As long as all the geometry then is contained within the 20 mile, Revit will not give you an issue. Okay, and that means changing a survey, yes, but as I've explained in the main video, if you're doing it in a controlled, repeatable manner, you can do it. because you can always tell people where that origin point is. Also make sure that if you still get that error, it may be, for example, see this is one block. That block's origin point is 20 mile is like thousands of miles away. Therefore, it's still going to generate that error. So you also have to make sure. I've been in projects where the trees were defined with their origin point like 250,000 miles away, and therefore it still gave you that message. So sometimes people will sit there and explode it and get rid of all blocks in the file. I'm not saying you want to do this on your project. Please don't do it because people will hate you for it. But if you are in a project, this is something that you can do to kind of mitigate that.
Awesome. Thanks, Krigh. So the next one is a troubleshooting question, actually. Um,
Okay.
this is a common one that I think a lot of firms and consultants here is they say the architect accidentally moved their survey point and now our MEP isn't aligning with theirs. They're saying they fixed their shared coordinates and it's appearing fine on their end, but now our elements aren't aligning to the architectural model as they should. What is the best workflow to troubleshoot this?
Okay. This is where one of the things I actually didn't mention in any of my sessions, which is worth noting, if you're going to set up something like a little common origin point that things are being coordinated around for the project, where you say, okay, this point on the project should read this in real world coordinates. As an example, it might be that, like in this case, I use a common point that's on the grid line as a setting out point, but it might be that you sort of say, okay, the corner of the property line, or if you don't think your building's going to move around at all, I wouldn't pick typically a grid line because buildings do move. Okay, they might shift a foot left or right or something like that, but so that property lines don't typically move. Pick a corner of a property line, get the spot coordinates from it, put that into the BIM execution plan. Whoever is prime, put it into the BIM execution plan. That should be your one go-to, that if then you go to your file and do a report and the coordinates are reading correctly, but the architectural team isn't, then you know who's to blame. And you can go and point that out to them. If, on the other hand, their file is reading correctly, your file is reading correctly, there may be another. Then you've got to kind of make sure everyone's still linking by shared coordinates. Sometimes people disable shared coordinates and the two files are actually just linked in to each other, but they're not actually linked and stayed in sync. So do check that. But I would sort of say the biggest thing that I can sort of say to mitigate that is pick a point, get it into the BIM execution plan, make sure everybody agrees on it, and that way you'll know who is basically out of alignment.
Awesome. So with that one, you actually had mentioned that you pick a point like a point on the property line, and that's the definition so that you can compare the points. What is a best practice, or what is a kind of a key theory to what point you actually pick to be that centralized point?
So in my examples here, the I don't typically, like, I want to localize my files by kind of a certain point that I can link. So in this case, I link in my CAD files. And if somebody suddenly gave me, like in the UK, everybody works, if you guys haven't worked with it, the Ordnance Survey Grid, because everybody there works on the common grid, at least the architectural teams. Because they do, if you suddenly get a new survey, you can say, well, I want that survey set out on the Ordnance Survey Grid. And if they do that, then you can go and place that marker, that little, in this case, I put this little 0 by 0 marker on that point. And I can do that in any of the files by basically moving it to a certain round number coordinate point. So if I actually report on the shared coordinates for that file, and let me just see if I can. So what you should see is you should see these numbers show up, the ones that are on the grid line. And that's why I use a shared coordinate or a grid line in this case. So if I go in, no, I don't want to save. If I go in here and I pick that, you should see that those numbers will now read the same as those grid lines that you saw on the outside. And that's why I use that point. Now, the problem with that is you can't really say, well, that's the common point for the project. So what you may need to do is you may say, okay, well, actually we want to have a particular point for um, that's actually on the site that we can pick and that is in everybody's file. So you might use the corner of a property line or something like that. Like I said, I wouldn't use grid lines because the buildings and grid lines do move depending on the structure of the building as it develops. Property lines are a better place to go. So it's something you have to talk to the team and coordinate and record as part of your BIM execution plan.
Awesome. Thanks, Krigh. Have you ever encountered hosted families jumping around or deleting while utilizing shared coordinates?
Oh, that's one of those ones that comes up really a lot of the times whenever you're dealing with links in general. Um, and yes, the hosted elements, usually if it's hosted to a face, it's typically better than if it's hosted to, like if you have a wall hosted element, um, those typically will give you more issues than if it's something that's sort of face based. Um, but I haven't seen necessarily, none of those should move or have issues as long as the files are, um, what do you call it? As long as the files don't actually separate. And this is where it gets tricky, because if you establish your shared coordinates and then as you're working through it, somebody says, oh, we need to update your shared coordinates, you may need to do things like disable your shared coordinates, redefine them, and then re-enable them, and then reload a link to make sure that the files don't kind of suddenly separate. But the other thing about them in general, the shared coordinate, or to go back to the question, the shared coordinates themselves shouldn't cause a hosted element to move. It's more whether or not the shared coordinates are changed and the files are actually moving together or apart. Does that make sense?
Awesome. So the next one kind of stems to the fact that some people don't actually have the shared coordinates or the coordinate information at the onset of the project. So when they
Yes.
have to go back to the client or to the owner or to the prime consultant to ask for this information, what's the key information they need to ask to get the correct information to set this up properly?
That is a brilliant question. And that's the thing. A lot of projects you're working on, they don't have a common setting out point. Um, this is one where when I was dealing with this in the UK, it was a lot easier because the Ordnance Survey is their standard grid that the architectural teams worked on, and everybody kind of used it. And so you could very easily start up a project. You were given a file. Like in this case, this isn't even a survey per se. This is actually like it's not like somebody went out there and measured it on site. This is one that you purchase and you as a general overview. And you could always start your projects with this. If you're dealing with a project where you either don't know about your local, you don't have like a standard setting out, or you're not as familiar with it, or B, you don't know, uh, or it's a place that doesn't have a coordinate system or something like that. Yeah, a lot of this, like you can research and you can sort of dig into it, and you might have one that you can use. You can talk to local surveyors and sort of establish one. But in the end, if you really aren't sure, like a lot of this, so I guess in a roundabout way, what I'm trying to say is a lot of this is usually set out by whatever the local surveying groups will use. But if you don't have a particular site, or a particular real world coordinate system, what I would typically do is pick something in the area that you can kind of say, like a corner of a property line or something, as a local point and start from that. Because you're still better off kind of establishing something that everybody on the team kind of knows is a local point. It's a lot easier because then you can kind of say, okay, well, because if you just kind of link their files in origin to origin, and you've kind of got your building floating out somewhere, and let's say the actual origin is somewhere in the middle of this white space here, it's very hard for everybody to kind of do a spot coordinate on, say, the corner of a property line and know, okay, what is that set out in relation to? So I would typically use the corner of a property line, or some sort of benchmark in the area as a starting point. And then if things change and you guys get real world coordinates and suddenly you get a survey and the survey comes in and they go, well, actually we used a benchmark that's, 250,000 miles that way. then you can update your system then. And it's a bit of work, but you can do it.
Awesome, perfect. So the next one is actually for from a user that isn't currently using shared coordinates, but they want to implement it at their firm. What would you describe for him to be able to bring to their leadership team that are the pros and cons with implementing it to their Revit workflow?
Oh, I like that one. Okay, pros. It's the fact that okay, so shared coordinates. I mean, besides the fact that hey, show them my slide deck and pull a few of those points out of it. The pros are things like the fact that you with shared coordinates you want to get everybody on um, a consistent like you if you have your files and they're just linked in, what will happen is let's say somebody accidentally moves a file. You with shared coordinates activated, it will prompt the user, do you want to save this back to the other file? It will give messages, and then the other thing is if somebody then relinks the file in and you've changed the coordinate system, it actually moves them. And in some ways, yes, it causes more complications in that way, but at least you'll catch the fact that it's happened. I've had projects work where people linked them in origin, they never initiated shared coordinates. And then as the project progressed, somebody accidentally bumped one of them out by 15 millimeters, which that's like half an inch. Um, and nobody caught it, but it caused such havoc later on because we realized that half the project had been modeled 15 millimeters out. So it's that thing of establishing the stuff right up front is better. The other thing is this is the way the industry is going. If you guys aren't working on projects where you're setting things out using coordinates now, picture 5, 10 years down the road when drones are being used to survey the site, or they're using, or every single project that you're working on is using a robotic totaling station to set out the exact positions for the different structural elements going in on site. I've been on a site where they were setting out every single house by positioning a marker and then saying, okay, the laser hit right here, that's where we drill. So if you don't get that right, then as I said in my presentation, you could have a building that sits across a property line, which isn't a good situation to be in. That's the other thing. Show them that article and say, we want to avoid that in the future. So those are kind of a few of the pros and cons. But yeah, just hopefully that'll kind of give you a sense of it.
You'll maybe have to upload that material to your downloadable materials for this course, Krigh. It is a good one, a good case for it. The next one that we have, first a compliment to you. Your webinar is amazing. Is there any way you can make it so that adjusting the angle won't impact any views on sheets?
Adjusting the angle won't. Okay, so I'm going to guess that they're talking. Okay, so if you're working on your views on sheets, actually, hold on, let me bring this up. Okay, your views on sheets. Sorry, my computer is a little slow today. Okay, so in this case, if your project is set to project north, right here, changing the angle to true north should not affect any views on your sheets. Okay, if your project is set to true north and you update your true north angle, this will affect your buildings on sheets. Um, so if on the other hand, you're updating, if you're going up here and you're using this manage, let's see, is it always, yeah, manage position and rotate your project north function. If you're using that, first of all, please watch my full webinar where I will explain why you shouldn't be using that tool because certain geometry ignores it. But then the other thing is that function, yes, will affect the orientation of everything on the sheets, and that's again why I wouldn't use it. I typically would typically if you need to reorient stuff in a certain way, scope boxes, but otherwise watch my tutorial and the process I go through it in my full webinar, um, and try to avoid using that function. And like I said, if you're rotating your true north, you kind of want it to affect because that is the angle to true north. I hope that answers the question.
Awesome. Thanks, Krigh. So the next one is Can I set up a site placeholder file inside my template file so I can get my view template correct?
Okay, say that one more time.
Can I
Can
set
I?
up a site placeholder file? So creating that site file inside a template file so I can get my view template correct.
Yes, because in some ways your view. Okay, so you can set up your view templates. You can set up your site file so that it has everything oriented. The only thing you won't be able to do is actually set out your shared coordinates. So in this case, like this is where, for example, going back um, to my example that I've been using that's real world here. Um, Hold on, let me just go back to here. This one doesn't want to get off the screen. Um, Hold on. Okay, there we go. Um, this right here is my project north. Okay, so this is my. You can kind of see this. I've got a reference plane in here, and you can set up everything inside the site file. Put in your view template. You could put in graphics. You could put in a couple of basic elements. The only thing that you're not really going to know is which orientation is true north. That's what's going to be set by your shared coordinates at a later time. And if you're doing it inside the site file, the other thing about it is you can set up your view templates, how you want it to set out and everything like that. And then you're linking the buildings into that and positioning them like little Lego blocks on your site file. So they don't matter which way is up for them. It really is about you just starting your file here. And in this case, as I sort of showed you guys in my in the full session, that this file here is actually the CAD is actually rotated. So the actual orientation for everything going up is actually what you see here. So you can set everything like that. And in theory, you could put that, you could even have that as a view on a sheet ready to go. You might have to change size, might have to change sheets, but it could be set up that way.
Awesome. So we have a three-part question for you. It all ties together. How does coordinates apply to model elevations? When I acquire coordinates from a drawing, does it include a Z coordinate? Does that mean it moves the survey point away from the sea level?
Okay. So the first part, um, elevations, yes. And if any of you guys haven't downloaded the full data set, so if you go under the AU website, go back to the page where you found the link to this webinar, um, and you will find the data set. And inside that zipped file is this is how everything works in elevations. Now, it doesn't have multiple models linked in, but yes, the file, you can actually have it set out so that, for example, you can say that your level 1 is at 24 meters above sea level, and that this will then position your origin point way down here by shared coordinates, right? So it's not your origin point in your Revit file. That's actually still sitting at your level. But yes, going back to, I think I caught that. That was the first bit. The second bit is that, does it actually affect it if you acquire coordinates? Yes, it will. So it will basically tell your model, and if your levels still aren't reading correctly, it may be because your levels are not set out by survey point. Okay, so keep that in mind, is that if they're not set out by survey point and they're set out by base point, your elevations might not be doing set correctly, but that you actually will have, they actually do set by a real world elevation. And then in here, I explained also that you can still get them to set out by project base point, because there are some architects that like to have their stuff set out by nice round numbers. Um, and so you can do that. But did I answer all three, or was there anything missing in that?
No, I think you hit them all.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so we have a best practice question. In your opinion, should you move the building to a location and acquire the shared coordinates, or should you input the coordinates into the building model and use the survey point and project base point?
Okay. So jumping back to the example here, if you were doing this model here, let's say building A, and I was working on it, and I wanted to. I haven't done it. I haven't done the handshake yet. Traditionally, what I would do is I would link in my site file. I would
Hmm.
move the site file around so that my building is then looking like it's in the right spot, and then I would acquire from it. The reason I would do that is just because it's easy. I'm lazy. Okay. If you do, you could use the project base point and set it out. You could use the survey points and all that stuff. You can go up and say specify coordinates at point. But the easiest part of shared coordinates is that initial I want to acquire or publish. And because after that, it starts to get hard and you actually have to go through and say, okay, now I need to update these values. But in that initial one, I would take my site, kind of crank it around my building file until it's in the right spot, and then I would say acquire, and then that now has done the handshake between the two.
Definitely. That's awesome.
And
If you have a building where you make a copy that you're going to use and build again, but on a different location, how do you update your coordinates without physically moving the model?
aha, um, wait, how do you do it without physically moving the model? Oh, okay. So the second part of that caught me. And by the way, guys, I was just going to say, if you do like the session, please go back to the site and hit the recommend button. I know this sounds like such a YouTube thing to say, but the recommend button is how they're doing feedback this year on all the sessions. So if you are finding this a lot of fun, please do go there and say, yes, you'd recommend this course. Give it a thumbs up, and Autodesk will know that I did a great job doing it and answering your questions. Okay, so how do you do it without moving the file? So I did this example where this is actually the same model, and I'm going to show you guys what I did. This one I did it in the bonus material that I put on YouTube. If you can find it, I might take a few days before it filters up to the top. What I did here is I actually did do it by moving it on the site. Okay, and the reason I did that is because I went over here. Let me bring this back onto the screen, and I disabled my shared coordinates. Okay. And I did that because I didn't want to update this. Then what I did is I can copy that model to a new position. So let's say we're doing a repeating house type down the street. Okay. And now that I've moved it to a new position I'm in my site file. Okay. And then I can go in here and I can say, okay, now I need to record this. Okay. And I need to record this position, and I can go into here. And again, it comes on the wrong screen. You'll see that I have different ones in here. I've got in use, I've got on site, I've got option 2. So I can actually duplicate this now, and I can do, let's say, plot A2. Let's just say that's A2 location. And what that'll do is it'll actually record this now as A2. And if I hit save, it will save that position like this back into that file. Now, if you, going back to the question, if you're inside the building file and you haven't updated it, okay, or if you don't want to move it, this is where it gets a little bit trickier, because what you'll have to do, and I kind of show it in the bonus material. In this case, you have to remember, the reason it's not showing the additional sites here is because this is the actual site file. So the site file only knows one location. The buildings know multiple locations. But if I was to, and I'm just doing this for the sake of saving time, because if I open up that other file and we've only got 7 minutes left,
Hmm.
it's going to take me time to do. But what I would do is I would go in here and I would duplicate. So if you were inside, let's say building B here, you would duplicate, and then once you duplicate it, set it as current, okay? And then start to affect the coordinates by saying specify coordinates at point. If you do that, what's going to happen is it will basically affect the second site, but not the original first one. So what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to basically have site A and site B. And that's what you see when I kind of look at this model. And if I go in here and I click this, you will see that this one now actually has 4 different potential locations. It actually had this because I think one of them was the building, one of them was the building rotated 90 degrees on that one spot. So that's those two. And then I had a second one, which I called A2 as well. Sorry, a little bit confusing here. This one is also, maybe we should call it A3. Okay.
Awesome.
So hopefully that answers
So we
that.
have we have another one on point clouds, and I know our experience is limited, but you might know of others in the industry who have done this. The comment is we've used shared coordinates for our point clouds, and the issue that we have sometimes when we reopen the project, the point cloud will be off in space, and we have to reload the point cloud and get it back to the right position. Have you ever experienced something like this?
No. Next question. No, I'm apologies. Unfortunately, I haven't worked that much with point clouds, and I don't know what the issue is. The only thing, like, and it's completely unrelated to your question. The only thing I have come across is that sometimes the CAD files that I've linked in will rotate themselves back after I've rotated them. And I think that that was more of a function of when I linked them in, I set it to orient to view or something like that. But I
Okay.
don't know the answer to the point cloud one.
Okay. We'll give you another quick one here. So when specifying coordinates at a point, the model elements do not move relative to Revit's internal origin, but the survey origin is shifted relative to Revit's internal origin. Is this correct?
Yes, it is. And so
Yay!
that is somebody who has moved closer to becoming a shared coordinate ninja. The whole thing that I covered off in my session, and it wasn't until recently that they showed you guys how the shared coordinate origin is revealed. And most people
Mm-hmm,
would have argued again and again that, oh, but that means that everything's moved away from the origin point. But no,
mm-hmm,
if you do that, if you specify coordinates at point, basically what it's doing, if you've seen my other example, it's like the concept file. It's basically moving, and let me just bring this one down here. Um, what it's doing is everything in this file, it's moving the sort of setting out from the shared coordinates down here, okay? But it's not necessarily moving the model itself relative to that origin point. Yes, that's correct. And we've
awesome.
got, okay, so we've got 3 minutes left. Just conscious of
We've,
time that we can't go over our hour, but
we've got
maybe
3 minutes left. And we
we have
have
another one.
actually a couple, yeah, we have a couple questions. This one's more in regards to your experience, and this question keeps popping up, so I do want to ask it. A lot of people have noticed the excellent Welsh street names. What is your connection to Wales, and why is in your presentation? Were you here on holidays? Were you visiting? What was
No,
this?
it was one of those ones where, as I explained in my main tutorial, I spent 8 years in the UK, and because they have the Ordnance Survey Grid, which goes over the entire United Kingdom, um, it it just happens that when I was looking for an exercise file, I went to one of the suppliers in the that gives out sample files, and I think it was UK Map Center or something like that. I've got it in my presentation, um, and when I downloaded the file, they said yes, you can use it with permission, and I just happened to afterwards. I mean, to be honest, I didn't even know it was in Wales until I was a little bit curious and kind of said, "Well, wait a second, I'm still a bit confused. Like, what is here? Like, there's actually a retaining wall." I actually looked at it on Google Street View and kind of looked at my real world location, and hence, yes, you guys are probably all confused about the Welsh names. I'm not Welsh, but I lived in the UK for 8 years, so that's the only connection there.
Definitely. Well, thanks for sharing. That's awesome. We have about 1 minute left, and so I think to kind of wrap it up, somebody wants to kind of go against the grain of shared coordinates and ask if you would ever advise anybody to not use them on a project.
Oh, that's a good one to end off with. Um, whatever to. Ooh, um, I mean, if you're doing something like a very small, like retail project or something like that, like especially, yeah, like a lot of interiors projects where you're dealing, I used to work in interiors. If you're dealing with that and you're not doing real world coordinates, a lot of the times it's pretty easy to just do things origin to origin and just make sure that everybody keeps things that way and you pick the files and you pin them in place. that would
Hmm.
be the only case where I would sort of say, keep it simple. Don't bother with the shared coordinates. Just make sure everybody starts their files the same way. But at
Sure.
the same time, as I've sort of said before, you won't catch things like if two files misalign and stuff like that. But if I was working on a very simple job like that, that's basically where I wouldn't use shared coordinates. I don't use them if I'm doing like a little retail outlet or something like that. We would just link the files that way. Okay.
Definitely. That's fantastic. And that is about time for us. We'll let you wrap it up
Okay.
there, Krigh.
So thank you very much, everybody. So appreciate you guys tuning in. And yeah, if you've got any other further questions, please go to my page on AU. Um, Click on the comment button. You can add in additional questions there. I will try to respond in the next few days. Hit the recommend if you really like the session. And please do search me up on YouTube. I will be getting more videos on there because everybody seems to really want to know more about how to master this dark art. So hopefully that'll help for you guys. Okay. Thank you very much for coming to the session.
Thank you.